Rabbi, let's
Morning,
wait
everybody.
just 1 minute or so. There was another class that just ended, and there's a couple
Okay.
people coming over from there. So,
Okay, good.
I think we got all the folks from the other class, so you are welcome to start, Rabbi.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. It's a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful Sunday as we start a four-part series. It's nice to see everybody. I see so many familiar faces, of course, and it's wonderful to have you with me this morning. And I want to thank Jennifer Rosen for coordinating this class, as she has been coordinating everything that has been happening at Beth Yeshurun since this pandemic began and beyond. And what a tough job this has been for Jennifer. It's always a challenge being the program director, especially of a big operation like Congregation Beth Yeshurun, but to deal with the tremendous challenges of having to do everything, almost everything online, and then how to coordinate the in-person things which have been taking place sporadically, like it did last Friday night, which was a great success, I hear. But she's done it, and she's been a fabulous addition to our Beth Yeshurun team. And Jennifer, thank you for working with me today on this class.
Thank you for your
So
very
what we're
nice
going to
words. I
talk
appreciate
about,
it.
pardon me?
I said,
What?
thank you for your nice words. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Well deserved. So what we're going to be doing in this class is looking at American Judaism, essentially, and a little bit beyond that, because especially with the subject we're dealing with in this class, American Judaism, as we know it, really had its roots, of course, in Europe and in North Africa and in Russia, with one exception. The conservative movement is largely believed and held to be an American denomination of Judaism, and we'll be looking at conservative Judaism next week and see why it is so different from Reform, which definitely originated in Europe, and of course, Orthodox Judaism, which was global before there was an America, and it will be the subject of our conversation today. But before we really get into Orthodox Judaism, I think it's important for us to take just a minute to get an idea of just where these denominations stand here in the United States. So, Jennifer, if you could put that sheet up, we have just one little sheet we're going to be using for a few minutes, and then we'll be talking to each other face to face after that. I think what's important for us to recognize and remember, of course, is that the institution of movements is something fairly new in the long history of Judaism. Judaism began with the creation of a Jewish people back at Sinai, if you will, with the receiving of the Torah, according to our tradition. And throughout history, up until roughly the 19th century, if you were Jewish, then you were an Orthodox Jew. You didn't call yourself Orthodox because there was no other one. Orthodox means the one kind, the one belief. There was just Judaism, but there were many strains of Judaism. And there are still many strains of Judaism in the world today, and Orthodoxy most of all. But let's look at this sheet just for a second, just to get an idea of the relative strength of these movements here in the United States. A survey was taken just a few years ago by the Pew Institute to discover what is the relative strength of the movements in Judaism. You'll notice it says In this survey, Reform Judaism continues to be the largest Jewish denominational movement in the United States. 1/3 of all U.S. Jews identify with Reform. 18% identify with conservative, and 10% with orthodoxy, and 6% with a variety of smaller groups such as the Reconstructionist and Jewish renewal movements. We'll be looking at those a little bit in our fourth class. However, and this is a very interesting statistic, about 3 in 10 American Jews say they do not identify with any particular Jewish denomination. So notice what that means. About 3 in 10, about 30%. So the second biggest denomination, if you will, in the United States today is nothing. Okay? So 35% Reform, 30% nothing. And then the next one down is 18% conservative, 10 orthodoxy, and so forth. And this is the real challenge. When 3 out of 10 Jews say they don't identify with any particular Jewish denomination, which really translates into saying that 3 out of 10 Jews just don't feel any connection to institutional Judaism as we know it. And that is usually defined by a relationship with the synagogue or a relationship with some other facet of the American Jewish community. Typically, synagogue affiliation goes arm in arm with contributing to Jewish causes like the Jewish federations, Jewish homes for the aged, Jewish family services. These are all institutions where the overwhelming majority of people who give to Jewish philanthropies are synagogue connected. There's a direct cohort because synagogue connection generally shows a desire to connect with Judaism above and beyond the synagogue itself. And further, it is in the synagogue itself that you feel the connection to the broader Jewish community. And so when 3 out of 10 say they don't identify with any denomination, it really means that we have 1/3 of the Jewish community in the United States, which really is feeling Jewish inside, but is not connected in any real or meaningful way. That's not altogether true, perhaps, but it is a little bit true. All right, let's see if we can scroll this down. Jennifer, how do I do that? All right, now let's stop here. Though Orthodox Jews constitute the smallest of the 3 major denominational movements, they are much younger. On average, tend to have much larger families than the overall Jewish population, which suggests that their share of the Jewish population will grow. Now, this is something that is, we can observe it. It seems like there are more Orthodox Jews in our community, and they seem to be the demographic that seems to be growing. I mean, that's our impression, that there seem to be more Orthodox Jews, and there seem to be more Orthodox engagement in the Jewish institutions of Houston and American Jewry. Now, what's interesting is that in this survey, which was taken just a few years ago, the 10% of American Jews who call themselves Orthodox is unchanged from every survey that goes back to 1950. So if there are more Jews everywhere, how come the percentage has not really changed? It's still 10%, which I think is shocking to most people because it's got to be higher, right? But it's not the case. It's not higher. What is higher, though, is that we see the Orthodox Jewish community, and the Jewish community has moved into more visible positions in the American Jewish world. And so for a long, long time, Orthodox Judaism had what we might call an inferiority complex. Conservative Judaism was, until 20 years ago, the largest movement in American Judaism. Conservative Jews overwhelmingly were the highest engaged in Jewish Federation leadership, for example, family service, 7 Acres, all the different institutions. Conservative Jews were the largest group that played a leadership role in these organizations. Reform was close behind. With this shifting, there's been a change, of course. There are fewer conservative Jews today, are people who identify as conservative Jews than there were, even 20 years ago, 30 years ago for sure. And Orthodoxy, during this period when conservative and reform accounted for 75% of American Jews, if not higher, Orthodox Judaism was not in an ascent, it was in a decline, or at least it perceived itself to be in a decline. And so it did not engage in Jewish Federation activity. It didn't give, it didn't lead, it wasn't part of the community. It stayed only to itself. We didn't see them. And in many ways, we didn't include them. We didn't engage with them. And this is one of the great changes that has taken place over the last 3 decades, especially in the Jewish Federation community, which for many years did not really have a relationship with the leadership of the Orthodox community. That changed. It changed under Federation directors like Lee Wunsch, who's on this group here today. It changed in the mentality of Orthodox Jews themselves, who have been encouraged by the rise and ascendancy of Orthodox Judaism in Israel to be more assertive here. So it is not so much that the numbers of Orthodox Jews has really grown proportionally, but the presence of Orthodox Jews in our society and in our community and in our organizations has increased substantially. And seeing them more has given the impression that there must be more of them, when there really are not exactly, by all demographic standards, that much more of a change. The biggest change is between the Reform, which has gone up, and the Conservative, which has come down. I will just offer a footnote on this. We'll get to that more in detail when we come to Conservative Judaism. Many in the Conservative Jewish movement would argue that Reform's increase in numbers and Conservative Judaism's decrease in numbers may be real to an extent. However, Reform Jewish communities, congregations, temples, when they count their members, they also count a significant percentage of their members who are not Jewish. And there is a very high percentage of Reform congregations where, for a variety of reasons, there's a much higher intermarriage rate. Those who are intermarried that are not Jewish are counted as members, whereas in the conservative movement, only Jewish members are counted in the demographic surveys. And so that may account for a lot of the shift, as some of the conservative Jewish leadership says. If you were to take out all of the non-Jews who are counted in the Reform number, the number of Reform Jews would be less, the number of conservative Jews would be higher. That's probably so, but I don't think it would offset the tremendous difference between Reform and conservative Jews in this country. There's no question that Reform Judaism has benefited from the higher intermarriage rate in the United States, and the conservative Judaism has been definitely hurt by it. And that is just something that is all but unchangeable. And finally, we go down the page here, Jennifer, if you'll take us to the last paragraph. Most of the switching among the movements over the last decade or so has been in the direction of less traditional Judaism. The survey finds that approximately 1/4 of people who were raised Orthodox have become conservative or Reform, while 30% of those raised conservative have become Reform, and 28% of those raised Reform have left the ranks of Jews by religion entirely. So there's been this skew across from the Orthodox to the conservative, conservative to the Reform, Reform to the non-engaged in our community. So we see something which would, in one sense, not be very encouraging for Orthodox Jews, but on the other hand, the high Jewish birth rate has definitely had an impact on the rise of Orthodox numbers, or kept them at least stable, and that has been a very meaningful factor in the success of Orthodox Judaism. Okay, so let's take that down, Jennifer. We don't need that anymore. All right, now we're all back together. Okay, so let's look a little bit today at Orthodox Judaism. We'll start with the mothership, if you will, okay? Because As I noted earlier, Orthodox Judaism is Judaism. That's how Orthodox Jews see it. They don't see it really as Orthodox. Orthodox is a name that was added to Orthodox Judaism, not by Orthodox Jews, but by non-Orthodox Jews to distinguish them from them. Okay, how can you be a conservative Jew without there not being some kind of Judaism already? We didn't create Judaism. And so to say that we compare and contrast ourselves to Judaism would not have been a very good argument. So Orthodox was given a name, it was given a title, it was given some kind of identifier. But Orthodox Judaism now and always has really seen itself as Judaism. It is the core of our faith going back 2,000 years, if not further, 3,000 years, if you really want to go back to the very beginnings. Orthodox Judaism is just Judaism. That's how they understand it. It means to say that they accept a certain set of values. There's a certain set of beliefs that Orthodox Jews have. And it doesn't matter what kind of Orthodox Jew you are, Orthodox Judaism pretty much abides by a certain set of standards. And it is against these standards that conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism stand in contrast. So what are the basic principal tenets of Orthodox Judaism that regardless what kind of Orthodox Jew you are, you uphold these basic views? And if you don't, then you've got easy transition to a conservative synagogue or conservative movement or reform. You've got a way out. But very unlikely that if you don't believe these things, that you will feel fully at home in an Orthodox synagogue. Remember, Orthodox synagogue would include the Hasidim, the Lubavitch Hasidim, the Belzer Hasidim. It would include all kinds of breakaways from Orthodoxy in one country to another country. If you go to Israel, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of synagogues that have names attached to them. And the names distinguish the particular synagogues from each other in ways that are very meaningful to those who go to each of those synagogues. But to those of us on the outside coming into an Orthodox synagogue, they all kind of look the same. It's the small details which distinguish one Orthodox synagogue from another. But at the core, there are these basic values. So what are some of those basic values? Okay, being Jewish and religious are coexistent, which is to say you can't say you're Jewish and not mean that you're also religious. Okay? Now, that is not true in conservative and Orthodox and Reform Judaism. We all know people who are very proud to be Jewish, but will tell you, I'm not really religious, or I'm not religious at all. You know, we have members on our own congregation, Beth Yeshurun, who we never see. They're members of our shul since time immemorial, and yet they never come. They don't participate. They may give some money to support the synagogue on Yom Kippur. They pay their dues. Many of them pay it happily. It's their way of connecting to the Jewish community, but they don't really feel a religious push, and they're not interested in knowing about how they can become more religious. We have many members like that. We have many members who have other religious identities, such as they're Holocaust defenders and fighters, okay? In other words, we have people whose whole Jewish identity is wrapped around fighting anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. They are active in many of these organizations. That is their life. That is their connection to the Jewish people. They're not religious necessarily. They are simply connected in one way to an organization and a certain value and cause. We have others who are passionate about supporting our Jewish nursing home, the 7 Acres. I mean, it is the central identifier of their Jewishness. They don't feel the need to come to synagogue. They don't need to even be affiliated with a synagogue, but they do feel a need to support this Jewish teaching of honoring the elderly and standing before those who are frail and helping those who are frail. In other words, we have in non-Orthodox Judaism people who are identifiably Jewish and proud of it, but their pride is connected to a specific organization or cause or value that is not necessarily religious. And I would say that that is not uncommon in our non-Orthodox Jewish world. But in the Orthodox Jewish world, you can be all of those things. You can be supportive of ADL, the sort of 7 acres, Jewish families, all of them. But if you're not a davener, if you're not in the shul, if you're not a believer in the one God, then you are not truly, fully a Jewish partner in the Jewish religious community and in the true meaning of Judaism. A second value is following from what I just said a moment ago, a belief that God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, God is eternal, God is compassionate. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet. I mean, this is the 13 attributes of God, which we sing on Yontivs, on high holidays. All the values and characteristics of God that we believe. And in Orthodoxy, this is not optional. The belief in God is not optional. You don't go to your Orthodox rabbi and say, I love the Kiddush at UOS. That's why I come every week. I come for the Kiddush and to see my friends. Well, we're glad you come for your Kiddush and to see your friends, but do you believe in God? Do you follow the halacha? Do you live a Jewish life? You're really at the bottom of a ladder if you say no to any of those. You need to start climbing up in order to be truly a member in good standing, if you will, of the Jewish community. You won't be thrown out, but the rabbi's not really talking to you unless you're really listening and ready to grow up that traditional ladder to higher observance. Okay, that is the ultimate goal of Orthodox Judaism, higher observance. One of the things we say about Chabad, Chabad welcomes every Jew where every Jew is, right? Anybody can go to Chabad and you find yourself welcome and you're hugged and you're valued and you're appreciated. But Chabad is always trying to move you up from where you are. It's not saying we welcome you where you are and want you to stay where you are. We're talking about religious observance. The idea and the goal of Chabad is always to move you up, Not to move you up so that you'll become more active in JFS or you become more active in CYJ, but you'll become more active as a Jew, as a davener, as a worshiper, as somebody who observes the halacha and Jewish law. Okay? Second, I believe it is a very, very important belief in Orthodox Judaism. The Torah was revealed at Sinai and is the exact same text we hold in our hands today. It cannot be added to, it cannot be reinterpreted other than through the eyes of the rabbis, and the rabbis will decide how far the parameters can go that you can begin to question and challenge anything you read in the Torah. And this belief in Torah, it's from Sinai, is an inseparable part of being a Jew as Orthodox Judaism understands it. A belief in Jewish law being ultimately divine in origin and also unchanging. It's subject to interpretation, but only by those who are the masters of it, which is why Orthodox Judaism reserves to itself the right to interpret Jewish law. And Jewish law, by that means not just the laws per se found in the Torah, but the rituals and traditions that have flowed from it. I mean, there are many decisions that have been made over the centuries about what you can and cannot do in Orthodox Judaism. You cannot turn on a light. You cannot use electricity. You cannot watch TV. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. And then sometimes it'll say, well, you can do this. Was it just a decision that was made randomly? No, it was made by rabbis of great learning and teaching, primarily in the yeshiva world, Yeshiva University. There are some tremendous rabbinical figures in the Orthodox world who have the respect of the Orthodox rabbinical community around the globe. And it is these rabbis who have the strength of character and authority to say what can be done that has not been allowed before, or what cannot be done because, in their opinion, it relates in some way to something that has already been prohibited. Okay? Give you one example. You cannot use a camera. That's been decided by the rabbis for 200 years. You cannot use a camera on Shabbat. And they're talking, the original prohibition was about film cameras, the ones that had the film inside. And the reason was because there's a prohibition against ketiva, which means writing. You cannot write. Well, what does this do with writing? Because when you take a picture, you record an image on the negative. And that is seen as a kind of writing. You cannot do it. Okay? So the question has come up, well, what about a digital camera? A digital camera doesn't create any kind of image. Okay? There are zeros and ones, but it's got nothing you can see. You cannot see a thing on a digital camera that would suggest what that image is. The rabbis say, even if that is so, because a digital camera takes pictures just like a film camera, and when you are shooting the picture, it is exactly looking like you're shooting a digital film camera, then it is also prohibited. Okay? And they have a broader concept called marit ayin, which says if it looks like something that is prohibited, then it is also prohibited. Even if you can show that it is not really connected one to the other, it looks like it is. We have another example in the use of electricity, because the Torah says there shall not be a fire burning in your home on Shabbat. So what does it have to do with electricity? The Talmud itself, by its own criteria for what is fire, would rule out electricity. In fact, there were rabbis in the 1800s who said that electricity is not fire and could be permitted on Shabbat. But the overwhelming majority of Orthodox rabbis said that even if it doesn't meet the classical criteria, it does the same thing as fire. In other words, turning on a switch creates light, creates warmth, the very things fire does. So even though it isn't fire, it looks like it does the same things as fire, and therefore the great rabbinical leaders ruled that it was going to also be prohibited, even though it was different. You, as a pulpit rabbi, you cannot just say, well, you know, I've been looking at this, I've been studying this, I think it's really different, I think it's okay. You don't have that power on the local level if you're an Orthodox rabbi. You must turn to your teacher. You must turn to your yeshiva. You must turn to those from whom you learned Torah. And it is their judgments which will have the weightiness that will either allow or continue to prohibit things that people are asking about in the modern day. All right, we're going to take a short stop, and if anybody has a question about anything said so far, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Yes, Ronnie?
Okay. Have there, in the last, say, century, has there been a reversal within the Orthodox community of any law or prohibition?
There's never, to my knowledge, been a reversal of any law because the Torah is divine.
Correct.
Therefore, we don't have the right, they don't have to feel the right to say that what God commanded is wrong or we no longer accept it. Okay? So even so, having said that, the way the Orthodox deal with this is they do a couple of things. The first thing they do is they put some law on temporary hold, if you will. Okay? So you had, for example, some rabbis in Israel during this pandemic. And in Israel, the only rabbis that count are Orthodox rabbis and very Orthodox rabbis, okay? For example, in Israel, they allowed things, some rabbis of great renown, obviously, it only is those of great renown whose opinions took hold. But to give you an example, what do you do in Israel now if you can't go to a synagogue because there's a lockdown? And there's been several lockdowns, many of you know, in Israel. It's been very rough over there. I think in most ways, it's been rougher for Israelis to get through this pandemic than it has been for us here in the United States. Most of us, not all of us, most of us. But in Israel, of course, with a large observant Jewish community, what does it mean when the synagogues are closed and they're closed by law? And so there was a group of very, very Orthodox and respected rabbis who said that while Jewish law ordinarily requires you to have a minyan of 10 men in a room so that you can see each other in that room, okay? And if somebody leaves that room and you can't see them, then you lose your minyan. You have to have 10 men in the room all together, right? So my son, who's an Orthodox Jew in Israel, was telling me what I already had seen on TV. Every Israeli apartment, and most Israelis, overwhelmingly Israelis live in apartments. It's not like here where they have private homes. Very rare, only the very rich and famous. But in Israel, everybody has an apartment and everybody has a balcony. Now the reason for the balcony was so that every Jew could build a sukkah. You know, so you have a sukkah in potentially a sukkah in every apartment in Israel. And if you go to look at the apartment buildings in Israel, you'll notice that instead of having, like you do here, all the balconies lined up so that you have this beautiful synchronicity, you know, in every apartment building here in the United States, they're staggered so that no one's balcony is over the person beneath you, so that you have a potentially kosher sukkah that you can put the schach on and still see the sky.
Oh, that's
okay?
interesting.
It's very interesting. That's what they did in Israel. This goes back many, 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 many years. So, what has this got to do with having a minyan? Some of the great rabbis of Israel said, if you go out on your balcony and you look around your little neighborhood, your street, and you can see 9 other Jews standing on their balconies, and they can see you standing on yours, then b'sha'at chat, in a time of emergency, we will allow that to constitute a minyan. So my son said, it's no problem. His neighborhood is filled with Orthodox Jews. They all go out, whatever floor they're on, and they can see easily 10. You can see 10 in one eyeful. And so they constitute a minyan, and they can do the service together. They can daven Shabbat together, and they can learn Torah. They can read Torah. They can have somebody chanting the prayers like a chazan, a Baal Shachri. And these rabbis said, you know what? As long as we have this pandemic, this will be permitted. Okay? It's a stretching. It's a stretching because they're not in the same room, they're not in the same location, but they can still see each other, which is one of the requirements of a minyan, even though they're seeing each other from 300 feet away. These rabbis have said, you know, in an emergency, we can allow this. Now, many of the Orthodox rabbis in Israel said, absolutely not. It's better to daven alone and not make a game of the Torah, if you will, by trying to create what's not there. So you've got different attitudes toward this. But this is an example of, yes, the rule by these rabbis has not been to disregard what it is to require a minyan. It is to say that if we really want to stretch, if we really have to stretch, then we can still do it within the requirement of having to have a minyan. All right, I'll give you a second example, and then we'll go on to the next question. And that is, the Torah has a number of things in it which are very difficult for the modern mind to understand and accept. And one of them is the Ben Sorer, which is the rebellious son. This is found in the Torah. It says that if a child curses his parent, there's some other requirements as well, then the father is to take him to the elders at the gate of the city where he is to be stoned. All right, that's a tough law, very tough law. Now, how did the rabbis deal with this? Centuries later, how did the rabbis deal with this? And this was nothing that people would accept. Your child says some curse words at you. Yes, you want to slap him, you want to punish him, you want to lock him in his room, you want to kill him? So what did the rabbis say? They put all these rules about how the child said it and who heard the child say it and where was the child when he said it and where was the mother when she said it and they have all these rules that made it impossible for a child to ever be a Ben Sorer. It was just impossible to get all the criteria to work together that would allow you to still take your child to the gate. And then the Talmud goes on to say, And remember, the Talmud is approximately 1,500 years after the Torah. The Talmud says there has never been a ben sorer. Okay, which is to say there's never been a rebellious child. Now we know who doesn't have a child who isn't a rebellious child. There's always a time when a child says something really mean or cruel or inappropriate or, who knows what. And you look at them and you give them this, and everything else you do. And that's been going on since time immemorial. Kids test us, kids do this. The Talmud says there's never been a ben sorer, but the Torah says specifically, here's what you do when a child curses your parent. Did they actually dismiss the Torah law? No. They just put the criteria about what does it mean to curse a child, right? Because the Torah doesn't tell us exactly all the details, so they kind of filled in the details, which in effect annul the law. The Talmud is quite explicit. There's never been a ben sorer. All right. So you ask if the Orthodox rabbis will actually eliminate a law, will actually say, no, we're not doing that anymore. No. Those are two examples. There are many, many others. Why don't we do animal sacrifices today? Why do we still pray for animal sacrifices today? Some of those laws have been put in abeyance, if you will, the rabbis say. Okay? And they'll be we can't do them because there is no temple in Jerusalem. And so until there's a temple in Jerusalem, we can't do animal sacrifices. So even if you wanted to, even if you said, well, why don't we? Torah tells us what to do. No, you can't do it now because there's no temple. The Torah doesn't say you have to have a temple, but the rabbi said you have to have a temple. Okay, so this is how we can make some changes, ease off on some of the most difficult parts of the Torah, and still be true to what the Torah's overall teachings are. One more question, any others? Yes, Debbie.
Yes,
okay.
Rabbi, getting back to your statistic, about 10% of Jews are Orthodox. What would you estimate, what percent of those are the ultra-Orthodox, the black hat types, these Hasidim?
I would say it's here in the United States.
Yes.
Here in the United States, I would say the black hat, if you will, that's what sometimes they're called, the ultra-Orthodox. I would say it's a very small percentage of the overall Orthodox community in the United States, 10%. I mean, they're very isolated. They tend to pocket themselves in specific locations, create their own separate communities. The way they avoid the temptations of the modern world is to separate themselves from them. The majority of Orthodox Jews in the United States are what we would call modern Orthodox or moving to the right, because there's no question that Orthodoxy in the United States is moving rightward, which is why you've got smaller little Orthodox synagogues throughout the country that are opening, and in contrast to the long-standing, beloved Orthodox synagogue that's been there for years and years and years. We have it right here in Houston, by the way. While UOS remains the largest Orthodox synagogue in Houston, the synagogue that is growing most substantially is Young Israel in Fondren Southwest. And the reason it is growing is because the new Jews who are coming to Houston who identify as Orthodox are looking for a more traditional Orthodox. They're looking for a right of center Orthodoxy. You go to Young Israel today, you'll see more people. There are more men there wearing a black hat. Okay, they're not Hasidim, although they could be Hasidic and go there. But you'll see more people there who are obviously not people who are engaging with the larger society. You go to UOS, you will find people that are much more engaged in the broader Houston Jewish community. And that is sort of indicative of where Orthodoxy is going generally. It's going more to the right. Okay? There's a little more return to a more fundamentalist religion. And that, by the way, is what we're seeing in the Christian world too. There's always parallels, honestly, between how Christianity goes, Judaism goes back and forth, right and left. at least in the United States and much of Europe. The evangelical church in the United States is the one that's growing. It's not the Methodist church. Methodist and many of the Protestant churches are mainstream type churches. There's variance between each of them, but the evangelical church really is a rejection of the mainstream Protestant church. It is an acceptance of a more fundamentalist understanding of the church and the teachings of the church. And that pattern is reflected in the Jewish Orthodox community as well. Okay. Okay, if you'll silence your
Rabbi, you muted yourself.
I'm a good listener. Okay, thank you. Okay, a couple of other things that we want to mention that are very, very important in identifying as an Orthodox Jew, and that is the Siddur. The prayer book is unchanging. Doesn't mean you can't add a modern prayer, but you cannot take out an older prayer. If a prayer is in the Siddur that no longer speaks to the modern Jewish mind, if it is a prayer which can even be offensive to those who are not Jewish, who might stumble into your synagogue, say for a bar mitzvah or something, everything stays, nothing goes out, but even if it has lost its relevance. And so I'll give you an example. So I was with an Orthodox rabbi once. We happened to have lunch together. And the relationship, by the way, between the Orthodox rabbis of the city and the non-Orthodox rabbis is very good. And Houston is an unusual community in having that kind of relationship. I did not have that relationship when I was in Providence, Rhode Island. And I certainly didn't have it when I was a young rabbi in New York, greater New York City. The Orthodox were totally separate and apart from anything that I was connected with in the non-Orthodox world. Some of that has changed a little bit, and for reasons we'll get to in just a minute. But in Houston, we can sit down together and talk, and it's very, very, very nice to have here. But we were talking about the prayer book, and he said he can never daven out of my prayer book. Okay, our prayer book, conservative prayer book. And I said, well, it's 99% Orthodox, honestly. The conservative prayer book is really, it's got everything in it. We might not do everything in it every Shabbat, but nonetheless, everything is in it. He says, you don't do a korbanot. What is he saying? That we don't pray for the restoration of the animal sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. I said, do you really seek the return of animal sacrifices in the temple should it ever be rebuilt in Jerusalem? He said, well, I said, well, we're just being honest about it. And he said, well, you can't change the Siddur. You still pray for it every day, but, it's up to God whether it happens. But we're not allowed to take anything out. And there's a number of prayers like that. We have another prayer called Ava Rachamim, which is very, very harsh about people who have harmed Jews. It's said right after the Torah service. Pretty rough. Conservative movement, to my great surprise, when it created the new Siddur Lev Shalem just a few years ago, decided to leave it in. But I was shocked, frankly, because there'd been great agitation to get rid of it, because we had non-Jews coming to the synagogue and they're sitting there just turning the pages, and they see this prayer, it's like, what? This is pretty rough, So what did our movement do? Conservative movement do? They put it in small print, which I don't know. There are several other passages that should have been either left in or taken out. And our movement's editors say some omit this. In other words, some omit this piece, which is really kind of repugnant. It should have been taken out altogether, or not translated, or something. It's from the old traditional prayer book. It's pretty hard language against non-Jews. Instead, they put, well, some omit this. Of course, when you put some omit this, everybody wants to see what is it that we almost omitted, right? It's got several little sections. Some omit this. It's like in the Hashkivena, we have it too. Which many of you know that prayer. It says, some omit this. Well, what the heck do we omit? I want to see what this is. It's right here, you know? Would have been better either to leave it out or not translate it or something, but to mark it that way, sort of put like a big asterisk next to it. Everybody's drawn to it. So I don't think we handled that particular editing decision the best way, but I wasn't on that committee. All right. Let's keep going. And Orthodox Judaism believes, finally, that all other Judaisms, if you will, are not true religion, are not true Judaism, and they are, in very blunt terms, heresies. Okay. So the fact that you can be a non-believer and still be calling yourself a Jew is something that Orthodoxy rejects out of hand. And so these are things which characterize and define Orthodox Judaism. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into the kinds of Orthodox Judaisms that we have in our country and in the world. And if you're worried that we're not going to cover all of Orthodox Judaism in one session, you're right, not to worry. We are definitely going to continue with Orthodoxy next week, and we'll start with conservative. We're not going to do one per week. There's more to say about Orthodoxy than the others because it has the longest history, it has the most variation, and it is the one which has become, from the beginning of Israel's founding, the dominant variant of Judaism in the state of Israel. And that has had tremendous implications, not only for Israel, but for us as well, living outside Israel. So let's take a look at what Orthodox Judaism or Judaism went through in its earliest stages. So Judaism was rather monolithic in the land of Israel from the time the Torah was given through the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. It is when the temple was destroyed and there was a tremendous exodus out of the land of Israel. Jews went essentially two directions. They went west to North Africa. They went northwest into Europe. And that gave rise to two separated Jewish peoples. It's not like today where we have the internet, we stay connected. In those days, if you moved into the Germanic lands of Europe, they're not Germanic, they weren't Germanic, they were that area, and you went instead into North Africa, you never saw each other again. I mean, that was it. You have two Judaisms that were no longer one community. They still had the core teachings that they shared, but there was nonetheless still a splitting, and each one developed a certain way. Now, when you look at American Judaism today, we are what is called overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi is a word for German, which means we come from Europe. We come from Central Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, most of Europe, with the exception of Spain and Portugal. Most of Europe historically was called Ashkenazi. And Ashkenazi grew up, evolved in a world that was heavily influenced by Christianity. That's who we lived with. If you went anywhere into Europe, you were living in a world which ultimately, by the 4th century, was officially Christian. When the Emperor of Rome adopted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, well, that pretty much took care of any other religions in Europe and in much of the world, but in Europe especially. And so Jews were tremendously impacted by the dominating presence of Christianity and an assertive Christianity. It was not a Christianity that welcomed the Jews who had rejected Jesus and killed their God. It was a Judaism which was not welcomed at all. And these who practiced Judaism were to be punished for the heresy of rejecting Jesus Christ. And so what happens when you live in an environment where you are surrounded by those who wish your demise, who do not accept you for what you are or believe? What you do is you tend to become more insular. You tend to pull the wagons around you, which we can translate into the walls. We created walls around us, and Jews, by choice, if not by law, chose to live together and in splendid isolation. Sometimes living in a ghetto, which came later, living in that kind of environment where you lived so completely set apart from everyone else was not only a wise decision in terms of preservation spiritually, but also in terms of preservation physically. If you lived behind walls that you could lock at night, you created a safer physical environment as well as a spiritual environment. And so Ashkenazi Jewry, the Jewry of Europe, from its earliest inception, was much more insular. It was also more complicated in terms of Jewish law and ritual and practice. And the reason for that is simply this. When you are restricted in what you can do, what you can be, where you can go, you create institutions that enable you to be somewhere with others like you, to be together, to share together, to learn together, to study together, to pray together, to eat together, so you have access to kosher food. You create a whole community which is very much apart, but it gives you an opportunity to be with your own kind in relative safety, security, and comfort. And if you're among those who are studying the Torah, what happens when you sit and study a passage from the Torah all day, every day, day after day, over and over, reading again, studying the verse, talking about the verse? What happens? You keep finding something else. And that's how we give rise to a whole body of literature called the Midrash, okay, which is to say these are the things that are not in the Torah, but the Torah left out. Like Abraham is suddenly chosen by God to leave his land where he lived and to go into the land of Canaan, where he will be made a great people. So why did he leave? Well, the Torah doesn't tell us. The rabbis told us. They sat around and said, there's a story, there's a reason he must have left. It must have been because he couldn't stay. Well, why couldn't he stay? Because his father was an idolater, maybe. Maybe his father was an idolater. He couldn't stay with his father, so he had to get out of that country. There was no Jews there. God wasn't there. But what did his father do that made him so repugnant? Well, he was an idol maker. And the stories go on and on. They get more lavish. They get more, my goodness. There's a whole body of stories about what it was like for Abraham growing up in his father's kingdom. Are these stories in the Torah? No. But if you're sitting and you're piddling and you're talking and you're thinking and you're schmoozing and you're this, and it goes on and for years and years and years and years and days and days and days and hours and minutes, you come up with an endless variety of additional thoughts that get incorporated into the faith. They get preached and talked about in the shul. Same thing with the laws themselves. The laws themselves tells us to shamor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. It says to watch over and protect the Sabbath day to make it holy. It doesn't tell you how to make it holy. It says you shall do no work. Well, what does it mean, no work? What is work? Okay, now you see what I'm talking about. So what is work? Well, is it this? Well, no, that's not work. Is that work? No, that's work. But what does it mean about that? Okay, then you get into the little nitty gritty, all the different things. So it says in the Torah that after they constructed the tabernacle, they rested and did not work. So the rabbi said, well, that must be that we can't do anything that they would have done when they were building the tabernacle, building the tent of meeting. Well, what was that? What did they do when they built the tent of meeting? Well, the Torah doesn't give us all the details, but the rabbis gave us a lot of, well, they must have done this. They must have done that. Well, just like they did this, then we can't do that. Well, this is just like what they did, but it's not quite the same, but it's very close. It's very similar. And so now all of a sudden you've got volumes and volumes and volumes of law on what you cannot do on Shabbat if you're an Orthodox Jew. I've got books that are thousands of pages of law. Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, the observance of Sabbath according to the law, that's filled with thousands of pages. The Torah talks about Shabbat like this. Okay, these are the prohibitions that come when you're sitting in a yeshiva, you're sitting all day, every day, week, months, years,
I've got a question.
talking, writing, extrapolating, deducing. And so in a world where you are locked in, which Orthodoxy was in Christian Europe for so many centuries, this was one of the great legacies of Orthodox Ashkenazi Judaism, was to create an expansive system of laws. Sephardic Judaism grew up in a different environment. Sephardic Judaism was in North Africa. It was influenced by the Muslim tradition. We may have different feelings about Muslims today, maybe on a variety of levels, especially in their relationship with Israel. But Islam had its parallels to Judaism in many ways. Of course, it was a daughter religion, but Islam was not nearly as oppressive as Christianity was. And the state of Israel, when it brought Sephardic Jews into the country, the criticism of Sephardic Jews by the rest of the Orthodox Jewish world in Israel was that they're too lax. They're not strict enough. They do things on Shabbat, they eat things, they do things that we never would allow. Sephardic Jews didn't have the oppressive pressure and the constraints of other opportunities. They didn't sit in yeshivas. They didn't sit and study all day. They were out working, they were out having careers in the Muslim world. And so the creation of Ashkenazi Jewry was very different from the creation of Sephardic Jewry. And many Sephardic rabbis, when they've come to Israel, have felt inferior to Ashkenazim because the Ashkenazim do not accept them because they're not strict enough. They don't have enough laws. They don't accept all the rituals and requirements and practices that are standard parts of Ashkenazi Jewry. Okay, we're going to stop there, but let me take a couple of questions before we go. Who's got a hand up? I saw a hand. No? Okay. All right. We're going to stop here. Do I have a hand? I don't see any. Okay. We're going to continue with Orthodox Judaism next week. We're going to talk about the failed attempt to establish a chief rabbi of the United States by the Orthodox world in order to bring some order to Orthodox Judaism when Orthodox Jews came to the United States. And then we'll move into the Hasidim a little bit because they have an interesting history of their own. And then we will begin our conversation about conservative Judaism. And we're going to begin our conversation about Reform Judaism because Reform Judaism was a direct reaction to Orthodoxy well before there was a conservative Judaism to even talk about. So we'll start Reform Judaism next week and go from there. All right? I'll see you next week. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very
Have a good day.
interesting. Very interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No, now we have to get into